You know, I think I would be probably dead if I hadn't moved into the house. Not even committed suicide, but it felt like I'd come to the end of my life somehow, and the end of my desire and aspirations and everything. When I first moved into the house, I felt a huge sense of relief. And it did feel as though somebody had plucked me out of the sea and put me on dry land.
The idea was to provide something with a very flat hierarchy where nobody was in charge. A place where people who were in the middle of a severe mental crisis could be able to live together, not in a prison-like environment or a hospital environment, but in something that was like a home for as long as they needed to regain their equilibrium.
The nature of how the PA houses operated was that it kind of broke down this kind of them and us type atmosphere that takes place. People who would come to meetings, they would often think that the therapists were the residents. Someone had written that the therapy in the house was what took place between the meetings. You know, you go along and talk to your therapist, but maybe it's what happens and how you deal with it during the week. That's the actual therapeutic part, I suppose, more than the therapist.
The relationship, I think, between diagnoses of mental illness and the sort of pharmacy that's available to treat them is an odd and complex and symbiotic one. Depression as a diagnosis, as a social phenomenon, is growing enormously. You'd think if the medication was working well, then the disease itself would be diminishing. I think if the antidepressants didn't work at all, it's hard to see why patients would take them. I think they clearly do something, but what they do is not as clear as is presented by the medical profession and the pharmaceutical companies. It might be, for example, that these drugs are potent mental tonics, but are actually quite general in their application.
I think that we all struggle. You know, for some people, when they find themselves in crisis or they're confused about who they are, they might end up in psychiatric care, which then might actually complicate things. The houses offer a space to kind of think about what that struggle's been about and how, in their own time, helps them reflect on the nuances of how they see things and why they see things in that way.
If you look back at the history of diagnosis and how it emerged, it seems that we're talking about medical conditions, and maybe we are, but these are really legal concepts. It's not like saying you've got measles. This is something that entitles patients, but at the same time it's something that can take their children away from them or lock them up against their will or deprive them of their liberty. So the language is one of the problems, I think. Thomas Zaz published The Myth of Mental Illness, arguing that these types of mental pain and suffering, which were real, to call them mental illness was only really a metaphor that had sort of slipped into being taken literally.
In the system of like psychiatry, there is a huge emphasis on goals and on an ending. The more in-depth therapies, they're more sensitive to the fact that the psyche can't be rushed and that it takes time.
can help to be on an acute ward if you're in an acute state and you need safety and you need sleep and maybe you need some medication to help you sleep. The downside of that is once, you know, the confusions that might feel a bit unbearable, once you start to confine them within a medical understanding, then people start to identify themselves by that narrative.
I don't think the landscape of psychiatry is as polarised as it was in the 60s. I think in a sense everybody's met in the middle. There's a lot of conversation about strictly defined rights to informed consent and to privacy and to dignity. This is a world that's been transformed by the critical psychiatry movement of the 1960s, even if it failed in its immediate stated, possibly utopian goals.